both with honours from California Institute of Technology and a PhD in planetary sciences from the University of Arizona. Dr. Horst's primary research interest is atmospheric chemistry, particularly the complex organic chemistry occurring in the atmosphere or on the surface of bodies in the solar system, and she is the academic lead for the Student Collaboration Experiment on NASA's Discovery Mission Deep Atmosphere Investigation of Noble Gases. She has an extensive CV and received an impressive number of honours, awards, grants and fellowships, which are too numerous to list in this brief introduction. However, some notable ones are the National Science Foundation Astronomy and Astrophysics Grant, the Peter B. Wagner Memorial Award for Women in Atmospheric Sciences, and Laboratory Astrophysics Division of the American Astronomical Society Early Career Award. So that just leaves us to give a Mexican Swinton Astronomical Society a warm welcome to Dr. Sarah Horst.
Thank you. Let's see if we can get my slides going. I have multiple monitors up, and so I can never see which one Zoom is actually sharing, which is a danger of this type of endeavor. Thank you so much for having me here today. I will warn you that on Thursdays this semester, I teach for 6 hours, and you have caught me just at the end of one of my classes, and so my brain is potentially made out of applesauce, but I'll do the best that I can. So today, what I want to talk to you about is just kind of to tell you a little bit of a story. I like to kind of frame this story as what I consider to be the job of a planetary scientist, which is to turn those points of light that you see up in the night sky or through your telescope into worlds that we can study using the same tools that we use to study Earth, to answer some of the biggest questions that we have about the universe, about life, all of those really big questions. And so tonight I'm going to tell you the story of how we have been working now for many centuries, using the royal we, to turn Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, from a point of light in the night sky into a world that we study and that we think has the possibility of answering some of the biggest questions that humankind has ever asked. So starting from the beginning, Titan was discovered by Christian Huygens in 1655. He was observing Saturn night after night, and as you can see in this hand-drawn kind of log, he noticed that there was a star, he thought at least, that appeared to be moving in kind of a regular pattern, and he was smart enough to realize over many nights that in fact it was not a star, that it was a body that was orbiting Saturn. And of course, at this point, we already knew about the large moons of Jupiter, and so Huygens recognized that this was presumably a large moon of Saturn, which turned out to be Titan. After that, we didn't learn very much for a really long time. We were waiting for telescopes to really catch up, to be able to provide us with any additional information about Titan. And so that took about 250 years. In the early 1900s, things kind of started to change. There was an observation that was made in August of 1907 from Spain. And the astronomer who made the observation claimed that they were seeing evidence of limb darkening. Limb darkening is a phenomenon that indicates that there's the presence of an atmosphere, because light interacts differently on the edges of planets where it's only interacting with gas versus when it's kind of interacting with gas and then the solid surface of the planet. And so he suggested that Titan had an atmosphere. There has been so much debate about whether or not he discovered Titan's atmosphere, because the telescope that he was using, a lot of people don't think was actually powerful enough to be able to see this phenomenon for Titan. The one thing he has going for him is that apparently he had a reputation for very keen eyesight, and with telescopes at this period of time, your own personal eyesight actually did matter to your ability to observe things, and so it's possible that he is the discoverer of Titan's atmosphere, but that's definitely something that's been debated within the planetary science community. Regardless of whether or not he discovered it, we didn't learn anything else for another like 35 years. And that came in the early 1940s with what is the definitive detection of Titan's atmosphere. So an astronomer named Gerard Kuiper was observing the giant planets Jupiter and Saturn, the 4 Galilean satellites, Europa, Callisto, Ganymede, and Io, and Titan. And when he did that in the near infrared, he noticed that there was a absorption band in the infrared that Titan, Jupiter, and Saturn had that the Galilean satellites did not have. And what that turns out to be is the signature of methane. And so Kuiper discovered that there was gas phase methane around Titan. That's pretty definitive discovery of an atmosphere. And so he wrote a paper that was called Titan, a Satellite with an Atmosphere. And I've always felt like that title is missing some kind of punctuation mark. I don't know if it should be an exclamation point or a question mark, but as you'll see momentarily, this was a very surprising discovery at the time, and I think has really held up as a very perplexing discovery as we've learned more. And so to show you why, I have this great graphic that's called the Not Planets. This was made by Emily Lakdawalla, who used to be at the Planetary Society. And she's taken all of the spherical or mostly spherical bodies in the solar system that are not planets and put them together here. And so you'll see, our familiar suspects, the Galilean satellites, Pluto and Charon are on here, Triton, our own moon. But smack in the middle is Titan, being very weird. And so the thing that this graphic really demonstrates so well is that Titan is a very odd object in the solar system. It is the only moon in the solar system that has a substantial atmosphere. It is the only not planet that has a substantial atmosphere. And so immediately we should know that Titan has something really important to tell us about planets, about planet formation, about processes that happen on planets. And so Kuiper's discovery was really exciting. That said, we had to wait another 30-ish years to have another big leap forward. You are going to start to notice a trend in a little bit. And so our next kind of really big leap forward was actually having to wait for a spacecraft to go to the Saturn system. And so in the early 1980s, the Voyager 1 and 2 spacecraft flew through the Saturn system, including a relatively close flyby of Titan, and returned this kind of not awe-inspiring image of Titan, I guess. I always like to joke with people that you too can recreate the Voyager flyby of Titan from the comfort of your own home with an iPhone and an orange, and you'll probably get about as much information as we got from this image, although your image will be much higher resolution. Luckily, Voyager was carrying other instruments besides its camera, and one of those instruments was an infrared spectrometer using those same wavelengths that Kuiper had originally used to discover the methane in Titan's atmosphere. And from the Voyager infrared data, the instrument was called IRIS, we discovered a number of molecules present in Titan's atmosphere. We're going to do a bunch of organic chemistry tonight, but it's going to be okay. I will walk you through it. Everyone will be fine. And so from the infrared data, we discovered all kinds of new molecules in Titan's atmosphere. There's acetylene, there's ethane, there's propane if you want to have your friends over to barbecue this weekend. There's hydrogen cyanide if you don't like your friends very much. And so we have this wide range of organic molecules that were discovered in Titan's atmosphere. The combination of these two things, this really intriguing organic chemistry and the fact that we couldn't see down to the surface of Titan, was incredibly frustrating to planetary scientists at the time. There could have been 10-foot tall Titanians waving at the Voyager spacecraft as it flew by, and we would not have known because the thick atmosphere prevents us from being able to see down to the surface. We're going to pause in our story for a minute just to orient you a little bit more with some important facts about Titan. Sorry to mention, Titan's really unique in our solar system. It's the largest moon of Saturn, and it's the second largest moon in the solar system. It loses out to Ganymede by just a teeny tiny bit. If you include its atmosphere, it wins. So it depends on how you want to count things. It has a mass of about 0.0225 Earth masses. So if you take that size and mass, you can calculate its density, which is about 1.9 grams per centimeter cubed. Water ice has a density of about 1, rock has a density of about 3, and so that density tells us that Titan is about half rock, half water ice. We know now from other measurements that have been done by spacecraft that Titan is mostly, if not fully differentiated, and so like Earth, the high density materials have gone to the center, and so most of the rock on Titan is actually, in its interior forming a core. The surface is presumably made mostly out of water ice. The surface temperature is really cold. It's 94 Kelvin. I can never even remember what that is in units that humans use because it doesn't matter. It's too cold. It's so cold that basically everything is frozen. And the surface pressure is about 1.5 bar. So that's 1.5 times the pressure that we feel at sea level here on Earth. And as I mentioned before, it's the only moon with a significant atmosphere, which means it's going to be really important for us to study. One thing that we need to think about, which will be important in a few minutes, at that temperature and pressure, we are very close to the triple point of methane. And so it might have been a long time since you've seen a phase diagram, but this is a phase diagram. Pressure and temperature showing us the conditions where each of those phases exist. Titan's very close to the triple point of methane. The triple point is where solid, liquid, and gas can exist simultaneously. We are intimately familiar with the phenomenon of a triple point because Earth is very close to the triple point of water. And so we can experience water in the gas, solid, and liquid phase, sometimes all on the same day, depending on what your weather is doing. And so this is our first, and it will not be our last, similarity to Earth. And it has really important consequences that you will see in just a few minutes. So like I said, Titan has a dense atmosphere of about 1.5 bar. That methane that Kuiper discovered turned out to be actually not the main constituent of Titan's atmosphere. So Titan's atmosphere is about 2% methane. The rest of it is 98% nitrogen, molecular nitrogen. And so Titan is not only has an atmosphere, but it actually has the only other molecular nitrogen dominated atmosphere in the solar system besides Earth. And so if we want to study processes that happen on Earth before life on Earth generate all of the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere, we can't build a time machine, but we can build a spacecraft and go study those processes that are happening on Titan today. Some of those processes are generated by sunlight. So sunlight interacts with those two molecules. It breaks them into pieces, which are very reactive. They run around forming new molecules. Some of those molecules continue to grow bigger and bigger until we form actual particles that form a haze layer, which you can see in this beautiful image that was taken by the Cassini spacecraft. This is very similar to the chemistry that results in the formation of smog on Earth. And so we get a lot of what are called hydrocarbons, which are just molecules made out of carbon and hydrogen, and nitriles, which are molecules that are made out of nitrogen and hydrogen. Titan's atmosphere also does have some oxygen-containing molecules. Carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and water are the two molecules that have been detected to date. Of those three, carbon monoxide is the most abundant, with an abundance of 50 parts per million. That doesn't sound like much, but that makes it the fourth most abundant molecule in Titan's atmosphere. The reason that I mention the oxygen-containing molecules is that all of life on Earth is based on the same small set of molecules. So all of life on Earth uses the same set of amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, and all of life uses the same set of nucleobases, which are the building blocks of DNA and RNA and some of our energy-containing molecules. That small set of molecules that is shared across all of life on Earth is based on a small set of atoms. And the smallest set of atoms that we think of as being a requirement for life as we know it are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. Those 4 atoms are all present in Titan's atmosphere, participating in active organic chemistry. And so this is one of the reasons why we're so interested in trying to understand Titan's atmosphere. So right after the Voyager spacecraft flew through the Saturn system, discovered all these organic molecules, my understanding, and just for context, I wasn't born yet, but I came along very, very shortly in the story. The planetary scientists who had been studying the Saturn system knew immediately that we had to go back. So the Voyager data were barely cold on the ground when a group of people formed to start planning the next mission to Titan to go answer all of these questions that we had about it. Unfortunately, our definition of need to go immediately is very different than NASA's definition of need to go immediately. And so although planning for the next mission to Titan began in the early 1980s, the mission itself didn't launch until 1997. That mission is called the Cassini-Huygens mission. This was a joint mission between NASA and the European Space Agency. It launched in 1997. It was 7 years in cruise, arriving at Saturn in July of 2004. Cassini was the orbiter. Huygens was a Titan probe. The Huygens probe descended through Titan's atmosphere, landing on its surface on January 14th, 2005. The Cassini mission ended in September of 2017 when we intentionally, that part's important, it was intentional, crashed Cassini into Saturn to protect the moons that we think are in the Saturn system that could potentially harbor life, but also to learn more about Saturn by studying it in situ instead of just remotely. Cassini was carrying 12 instruments. Huygens carried 6. In both cases, they were a combination of remote sensing instruments, so things like cameras, infrared spectrometers, and then also in situ instruments, so things like mass spectrometers. So using, your kind of touch, smell, taste senses rather than your looking senses. The Huygens probe is the kind of giant circle gold thing in this image. That's its heat shield. And just to give you a sense of scale, the white things at the bottom are actually human beings in bunny suits. So Cassini was about the size of a school bus. It was not a cute little Mars rover. Just another kind of to give you context and to show pretty pictures of the Saturn system. This I hope everybody recognizes is Saturn. There's a number of small moons in this image, although I haven't cleaned my monitor recently, so I might have a few extra moons than are actually there in real life. But down towards the bottom right, you can see Titan. So just to give you a sense of scale, although Titan is the second largest moon in the solar system and is larger than the planet Mercury, it is absolutely dwarfed by Saturn. This is the first picture that that Cassini took of Titan. I like to call it Titan's baby picture. It apparently wasn't scientifically important because nobody ever bothered to process it. This was taken actually before orbit insertion in 2004. This is one of the last pictures that Cassini took of Titan, and I'm going to talk you through this exact image in just a couple of minutes. This was the last image of Titan that Cassini took before Cassini crashed into Saturn. Because of Titan's substantial mass, Titan was used for all of the gravity assists to send Cassini on all of his various adventures during the 13 years that it was in orbit around Saturn, but also sent it on its final adventure into Saturn's atmosphere. So I told you we were going to do chemistry. It'll be okay. Everyone will live. So Titan has really complex chemistry happening in its atmosphere, and it's driven mostly by ultraviolet light from the sun. And the main reaction that's happening in Titan's atmosphere is that methane, CH4, interacts with ultraviolet photons, and it gets broken up, and those pieces react, and we make 2 molecules. One molecule that we make is ethane, C2H6, and the other molecule that we make is molecular hydrogen, which is H2. These 2 molecules have very different fates. The ethane will get very cold. Titan's tropopause is about 70 Kelvin, which at that temperature, basically anything will condense. And so the ethane ends up condensing into a liquid, which will sit on the surface. Once it's on the surface, it cannot go back into the atmosphere. There isn't enough sunlight that reaches the surface to evaporate the methane back into the atmosphere. The molecular hydrogen has a very different fate. Titan, because it's small and its gravity is about 1/7 that of Earth's, cannot hold on to molecular hydrogen, and so the hydrogen escapes and goes off on adventures in the Saturn system. That means that both of the products of this reaction are removed permanently from the atmosphere. And so what we learn from that is that the methane in Titan's atmosphere is actually irreversibly destroyed. The current abundance should take between 10 and 100 million years to get destroyed. That's much shorter than the age of the solar system. And so we still actually don't know what the source is of methane in Titan's atmosphere to resupply it. That is the simplest version of Titan's atmosphere chemistry. This is the slightly more complex version. You are under no obligation to learn anything from this other than to just see that it's complicated. There are many things involved with it and many connections. And even this graphic is extremely simplified version of the chemistry happening in Titan's atmosphere. There's many hundreds or thousands of different molecules, and many, tens of thousands of reactions that are occurring at any given moment, that we are challenged to try to model. But all of that chemistry results in the formation of a bunch of molecules. I've mentioned most of them already. These are the most abundant molecules in Titan's atmosphere besides nitrogen. We have our methane, hydrogen, and CO. I talked about those already. Argon. And then we have ethane, acetylene, propane. I can never remember what C2H4 is. I think that's ethylene, hydrogen cyanide, and carbon dioxide. These are the most abundant molecules in the atmosphere. These molecules are relatively small. And so prior to the arrival of Cassini, we really thought that most of the molecules in Titan's atmosphere, even though they were like bigger organic molecules than we had really seen in other atmospheres, and that was really exciting, like we thought most of the molecules were pretty small. And so the mass spectrometer that Cassini carried to study Titan's atmosphere by ingesting gases into it and measuring them directly was designed to measure gases that have a mass less of 100. And so prior to the arrival of Cassini, actually the biggest molecule that had ever been detected in Titan's atmosphere was benzene. So that's C6H6, it's that nice six-sided ring. It has a mass of 78. And so we kind of thought that if we looked at mass spectrometer data from Cassini, it would look something like this. The bottom of this plot is our mass, and the y-axis is just number in some form or another. It doesn't really matter. So that's what we thought the data would look like. This is actually not data from the mass spectrometer. We were really, like, I cannot emphasize enough how incredibly lucky we were. Cassini was carrying another instrument called the Cassini plasma spectrometer, which was designed to measure the teeny tiny ions in the Saturnian magnetosphere. So things like protons and electrons, and maybe like if you got really crazy, an oxygen ion, but definitely not anything heavy. However, the way that it was designed didn't prevent it from measuring heavy things, should it have the occasion to run into them, which it apparently did. So the actual data from the Cassini plasma spectrometer are shown here. Instead of seeing gases in Titan's atmosphere that had a mass up to like 100, we actually see ions very high in Titan's atmosphere, 950 kilometers above the surface, that have a mass to charge of up to 10,000. And this is mass to charge. These things are probably carrying more than one charge because they're so large, and so we're talking about molecules that might have a mass of 20 or 30 or 40,000 AMU. That's the size of a decent protein here on Earth, so these things are not small. If none of that made any sense to you, that's fine. I will give you a visual instead. So that's benzene, the heaviest molecule that had been detected in Titan's atmosphere prior to Cassini, C6H6, mass of 78, 6 carbon atoms. This is not a real molecule that I'm about to show you. This is a thing I made up in ChemDraw to demonstrate my point. But this is a molecule that has a mass of about 10,000. And so this is something that has 700 or 800 carbon atoms rather than 6 or 7 carbon atoms. And so that's just to give you a sense of scale about how wrong we were about the complexity of the chemistry that's happening in Titan's atmosphere, but also to give you a sense of why we're now even more excited about Titan than we were prior to the arrival of Cassini, because now we know that it has this atmosphere that's basically a complex organics factory doing chemistry that might be important for the origin or evolution of life and help us answer questions about how life originated on Earth. Suffice it to say, this discovery has really dramatically changed our understanding of atmospheric chemical complexity. The problem, though, with these data is that this instrument was not designed to do this, and so we can't identify any of the molecules in this data set. We don't know what they are. And we also can't really use computer models to model things that are this complicated. Computer models for Titan's atmosphere are really good up to like 7 or 8 heavy atoms, and we're talking about 700 or 800 heavy atoms, and so we can't use that tool. And so we kind of have one other tool in our toolbox. If we can't use data, we can't use computer models. One of the other things that planetary scientists use to try to understand the places that we study are laboratory experiments. And so that's something that we do here in my lab at Johns Hopkins and that other folks around the world do. The experiments are all kind of based on the same premise. We take simple, abundant atmospheric gases. In the case of Titan, we would use nitrogen and methane, maybe a little bit of carbon monoxide if we're feeling fancy. We expose those molecules to an energy source. The most common energy sources are energetic plasmas or ultraviolet light. Those energy sources break up those molecules in the same way that sunlight breaks up the molecules in Titan's atmosphere, starting chemistry that, just like in Titan's atmosphere, results in the formation of haze particles, which we can then analyze in the lab, depending on what we're trying to figure out. So one thing we were trying to figure out is, what are these things made out of? Is this, is there exciting chemistry happening? Is it boring chemistry, if that's, a thing that exists? And so one of the things that we looked for in some experiments that we ran when I was in grad school were some of these molecules that all of life on Earth is based on. So things like purine and pyrimidine bases, the familiar ATCGU of RNA and DNA, and also glycine and alanine, which are the two smallest biological amino acids, so our building blocks of proteins, were all found in these Titan samples that we made. I always have to point out here that if there is life on Titan, it almost certainly would not use these molecules for the same purposes we use them for, because the environment is so different. But we were looking for molecules that are familiar to us as an example of the complexity of molecule that life requires, and we see it in these samples. So now I want to walk you through a little bit more about Titan. Like I said, we're trying to turn Titan into a world that we can study and answer these big picture questions. And so here is our familiar orange ball. It is higher resolution. This is an image that was taken by Cassini, and it's also slightly less orange. It turns out, as folks got deeper into all of the theory around making a true color image, that the Voyager images probably skewed a bit orange. For Titan, you've probably heard about this, that Uranus and Neptune aren't actually that blue, which is very depressing. But Titan isn't orange, it's really more of a yellow color. From Cassini, we were able to study Titan's haze layers in greater detail. There's a lot of structure that you can see here that's caused probably by gravity waves. We believe that these particles are made out of hydrocarbons, nitriles, amines, aromatic molecules. If you've ever taken organic chemistry, all of those words that your professors told you, we think are in the haze particles in Titan's atmosphere. We're also able to study weather patterns on Titan, and so this is a large methane storm that was observed at Titan's south pole. We know that Titan has clouds and rain. They're primarily methane and ethane, especially when it comes to the rain, but Titan also has other flavors of clouds. So far we've discovered a ethane cloud, propane cloud, methane cloud, benzene clouds. There's potentially some evidence of C2N2 clouds. Titan has all different flavors of clouds, depending on where you are in the atmosphere. So the good news is that we learned a lot from the Voyager flyby through the Saturn system. And so Cassini's camera was designed with very narrow wavelength filters to be able to see down to the surface in regions where the methane and the haze don't absorb light. These regions are mostly in the near infrared. And so this is an image that allows you to see down to Titan's surface. This is actually the image that I showed you a little bit ago. And so I want to walk you through some of the things that we've learned about Titan's surface from Cassini, because Cassini and Huygens really unveiled Titan for us for the first time and really showed us a lot of interesting geology that's happening. So first, just to show you the image from the Huygens probe. So this is the image that Huygens took sitting on Titan's surface. Huygens actually lasted for another 90 minutes after it landed on the surface, but of course it was a probe and not like a rover or something, so it didn't have the ability to move, but it very, very diligently sent this image back to Cassini over and over and over again for 90 minutes. And so we have a really lot of copies of this particular image. It may look familiar to you. This image is very reminiscent of washes that we see in the desert Southwest that are dry most of the time, but definitely have these catastrophic floods when it does rain. And so you see evidence of fluvial erosion here in the form of these rounded cobbles. When this image was first returned, a lot of professional planetary scientists who had been studying the Saturn system for a living and knew that these data were from Titan thought this was a picture of Mars. And so we know that there's fluvial activity on the surface. We think that The surface is probably made mostly of water ice for the reasons that I mentioned before due to density. There's also the potential for some ammonia on the surface. So if you've looked at this image now for at least a couple of minutes, you'll have noticed that there's two different types of surface on Titan. This is very scientific. So, stick with me for a second. The surface has two things. It has the light stuff and it has the dark stuff. We think that the light stuff is probably this kind of bedrock, like we saw at the Huygens landing site, that's probably primarily made out of water ice and geologic processes that are acting on that water ice. The dark stuff actually comes in two forms, so I lied to you. There's three types of surface, the light stuff and the two kinds of dark stuff. If you are looking at the North Pole, which is up in this image, because that's the way you should orient planets, the dark stuff are extensive lakes and seas. So now instead of looking at an image from Cassini's camera, we're looking at data from Cassini radar. Your brain really wants this to be a picture. It's not. When we're looking at radar data, things that are dark are smooth at the wavelength of the radar. Cassini's radar is 2.2 centimeters, and so those really dark areas are smooth at 2.2 centimeters. For something to be that smooth at that wavelength, it is going to be a liquid. There are very few things that are that smooth at that wavelength. And so these are extensive lakes and seas. Some of them are larger than the Great Lakes here on Earth. You can see all these dendritic river channels that are very similar to river channels that we see here on Earth. You can see that some of these lakes have very clearly flooded into pre-existing topography. These lakes are made mostly of methane and ethane, which are the two major liquids that are coming out of the atmosphere. This is a region that we're really interested in because all of those organic molecules that are made in the atmosphere, those haze particles, will end up on the surface at some point. And when they end up in the lakes, they'll be able to do subsequent chemistry. So the molecules that are soluble will dissolve and potentially do additional chemistry in the methane and ethane. The molecules that aren't soluble will either end up as kind of like a gunk on the top of the lakes and seas, or will precipitate down and be in contact with water ice at the lake bed. And so there's potential for additional interesting chemical and physical processes to happen there too. Everything that's dark at the North Pole are lakes and seas. All of that dark stuff that you can see in this image. Looking further down, further south, we encounter the other dark stuff. All of the dark stuff you see from the mid-latitudes in the southern hemisphere to the mid-latitudes in the northern hemisphere are extensive dune fields. So this is now Cassini radar again, looking at one of Titan's sand seas. But if you were paying attention earlier, which it's fine if you weren't, that happens to me all the time, we don't have rock on Titan's surface the way that we think of it. That's made out of silicate. So this is not like quartz sand like we're used to on Earth. We think that the sand particles are made out of organic material that was produced in the atmosphere. And so sometimes you'll hear people talk about Titan's plastic sand seas or something like that. But we think the dune fields are made out of organic sand. We don't understand the processes that result in the formation of these sand particles. This is something that my former student Shinting Yu spent a lot of time working on during her dissertation, but we are pretty sure that despite the fact that we can't figure out how they get made, that is what is happening. There's one other place I want to mention on Titan, and those are impact craters. This is a particular impact crater called Selk crater. We're interested in impact craters because although Titan does have a subsurface ocean, which I always forget to tell people about, so just like Europa and Enceladus and all of those icy moons that have subsurface oceans, Titan also has one. We forget to tell people about it because of all the other cool stuff that's happening. But liquid water is not stable on the surface. And so when there is an impactor that comes in, a comet or a meteorite or something that makes a big impact, the top of that impact melt pool will flash freeze, but that acts to insulate the liquid water below. And so liquid water in these impact melt pools can be stable for tens of thousands of years. And during that time period, those organics that were on the surface will interact with liquid water for the first time. And when that happens, we know from laboratory experiments, we know from other chemical understandings, a lot of new molecules will be made, including the formation of a lot of amino acids and other molecules that are really interesting for the possibility of the origin of life. And so that's an area that we're really interested in. I'm gonna do some like skipping around of slides just in the interest of time because I want to leave time for you all to be able to ask some questions. So don't mind me while I skip some slides. I'm not going to skip this one because I think it's important for every human being on Earth to see it. This is the first sun glint that we have ever seen from another world. This is sunlight reflecting off of a lake at Titan's North Pole. This image, despite the fact that I have shown it to people a million times, never ceases to give me chills. We did not we were able to reconstruct from the spacecraft trajectory which lake the light actually came from. Lakes on Titan have to be named after lakes on Earth. That's our naming convention. And so this particular lake is now called Jingpo Locus, which means mirror lake, to kind of celebrate the fact that this was the first sun glint we ever saw from another world. So stepping back to our big picture, we think that Titan really has all of the key ingredients that are necessary for life. So there's sunlight that gets down to the surface, but there's also energy in the form of chemical energy. Those molecules that are made high in the atmosphere, a lot of them contain triple bonds, and so they carry that chemical energy down to the surface where possible life, if it was creative enough, would be able to use that energy. Organic material we have coming out of our ears, hopefully you have understood that at this point. The entire surface is covered in organics in one form or another. And so we definitely do not have to worry about the building blocks of life. We have those all over the place. The third thing that we think is necessary for life is a liquid. And usually when we talk about it, we're talking about water because that's what life on Earth requires. There's a lot of reasons to think that water is one of the best solvents, if not the best solvent for life. And we do have water on Titan, both in the subsurface ocean and also, as I mentioned, when we have these impact craters that form. But Titan actually has two liquids because Titan also has these large lakes and seas of methane on the surface. We have this active methane cycle where methane is going back and forth between the atmosphere and the surface, just like water does on Earth. And so it's possible that liquid methane could support the development of an alternate biological system. And so on Titan alone, we can really study prebiotic chemistry in the context of, a planetary environment where there's dunes and there's rivers and there's streams and all of the things that Earth does, all of these Earth-like surface processes, both to help us understand the processes that led to the origin of life on Earth, but also to search for life as we don't know it on this very active world. So how do we do that? What's next? Trying to move our story forward in terms of how we turn this point of light into a world. And so what's next, which is so exciting, is a mission called Dragonfly. So Dragonfly is a mission to explore Titan's prebiotic chemistry and habitability using a mobile platform. And so basically we're a rotorcraft lander that's going to do in situ investigations of Titan's prebiotic chemistry and habitability. Titan's gravity is 1/7 that of Earth's, and the density of the atmosphere is about 4 times that of the surface. And so it is much easier to fly on Titan than it is to fly on Earth, to the point where if you found yourself standing on the surface of Titan, and if that happens to you, please call me because I have a really lot of questions. But if you found yourself standing on the surface of Titan and you had some kind of rudimentary wings that you could attach to your arms, you could personally fly by flapping your own arms on Titan. It is that easy to fly. And so we're taking advantage of that to be able to access all of these different surface materials that I was showing you before that are tens or hundreds of kilometers apart. So we'll be able to go farther than Mars rovers have gone, for example. On the surface, we're going to do detailed composition measurements to try to understand all of those complex organics. We're going to study the geology. We're also going to study the meteorological processes that happen in the atmosphere, and we're going to search for seismic activity. While we're flying, we're going to do atmospheric profiles, and we're also going to do aerial imaging, both to study the geology and do science, but also to scout our landing sites and make sure that our spacecraft can land safely when it gets to its new landing site. So Dragonfly has 3 big picture science goals. I've been really harping on prebiotic chemistry, so we're going to analyze the chemical components and processes that might be producing these molecules that are interesting. We want to study the habitable environments, and so we're going to do things like measure atmospheric conditions and look for transport rates of things. And also we want to understand the processes that mix organics with liquid water, whether it was on the surface or in the subsurface ocean. And finally, since we've gone to all of the trouble of going there, we might as well look for biosignatures. And so we'll search for chemical evidence of water or hydrocarbon-based life. To do that, we're going to go to that crater that I just showed you before. That crater is called Selk Crater. It is kind of near the equator. We're going to be landing in the southwest in a region that's called the Inner Dunes region. There's a reason for that. So you might be familiar with Mars rovers that we can like pinpoint land and say, yes, we want to go to that exact spot on Mars. And when we do that, we have done high resolution imaging, like sub-meter imaging. We know exactly where we can send the Mars rovers that's going to be safe. We do not have anything even remotely near that type of imaging for Titan. This is the best picture we have of our landing site on the left-hand side, okay? So we had to be smarter. And so we're using physics to figure out where the safest place is to send our spacecraft. And one of the things that happens when you have dune fields like we have on Titan is you have these regions called interdunes, which are exactly what they sound like. They're between the dune fields. These regions tend to be very uniformly size sorted and very flat. And so that's where we're going to send our spacecraft to the southeast of Selk Crater in one of the inner dunes regions. On the right-hand side, there is images of Earth inner dunes region, so you can get an example of what it looks like. You can tell it's Earth because there's people in that picture. That's how I always check. And so that's where we're going to go. It gives us access to all of these different places. It gives us the dune fields. It gives us the ejecta blanket. We can go into the crater and measure things that are in the crater and look for all of these chemical processes that I've been talking about. I'm going to skip a couple more slides. I'm almost done so that we have time for questions. So we have a couple of different instruments that are very powerful. DRAMS is our mass spectrometer. That's really a big workhorse instrument for us because that's going to be doing all this beautiful chemical analysis that I've really been harping on. Draco is our drill for acquisition of complex organics. And so we'll actually be drilling into the surface to acquire our samples. And so we have a drill on one of our skids. Dragons is the coolest named instrument because I get to talk about dragons on Titan all the time. It stands for Dragonfly Gamma Ray Neutron Spectrometer. The gamma ray neutron spectrometer is going to let us kind of do big picture chemical composition underneath us wherever we land. We'll be able to get elemental composition. It's not going to tell us anything about the detailed complex organics, but it'll tell us this has this much carbon, this has this much this. That's going to allow us to compare our different landing sites and help us decide if we want to drill at a given landing site, or maybe this landing site seems really familiar to the last landing site we were at, and so we don't feel like we need to use resources to drill in that particular site. DragMet is our geophysics and meteorology package. So that's a whole bunch of different sensors that are kind of all over the spacecraft. We have a methane sensor, we have a hydrogen sensor, we have temperature sensors, we have a seismometer to look for seismic activity to help us understand how the surface is reacting to the subsurface ocean. And finally, we have DragonCam, which is a suite of cameras that range from a microscopic imager to look at the sites where we've drilled, all the way up to our navigation cameras that help us as we're flying. And so we'll be taking images at a variety of scales, both for scientific reasons and also, as I mentioned, for safety reasons for flying the spacecraft. A couple of other things just to mention because they're frequently asked questions and it crossed my mind right now, so I'll say it so that I don't forget later. Dragonfly is also not small. So a lot of people have in their head the kind of like backyard drones that people are used to flying. Dragonfly is not that. Dragonfly is the size of what we would consider to be a small car in the US. That might be a medium-sized car or a large car for y'all. But it's about the size of Perseverance or Curiosity, the 2 large Mars rovers. I apologize for my Americanness in the following statement, but it's about 5 feet tall and about 10 feet wide. So it is a very large spacecraft. Dragonfly has to do direct to Earth communication. So that circle that you see kind of on the top is our high gain antenna. We don't have any kind of orbiter to relay through the way that the Mars rovers do. And so we have to be able to talk directly to Earth. So we need that big dish. I'm going to skip a bunch more slides just so that we can finish up and then I can answer whatever questions you have. I just want to show you a quick animation, if it works, which it looks like it is. So this is artist conception of the scariest day of my whole entire life. So we descend on parachute until we get about 1.5 kilometers above the surface, at which point we will find out whether or not we can fly. We will then fly down to the surface to our initial landing site. We'll spend quite a bit of time at our initial landing site, as most like rovers would, checking out all of our instruments and making sure that they're all working well. This is, in a second, we'll show the high gain antenna deploying when it needs to talk to Earth. Once we're done at our landing site and we've done everything we wanted to do, then we'll pack up everything and take off and fly to our next landing site. And then we can do more science at the next landing site. We'll do this over and over again for about 2.5 years is the length of our nominal mission. The spacecraft should live much longer than that, as long as nothing goes wrong, knock on wood. So as long as NASA is willing to fund us, we would be able to continue doing science for longer than that and access additional landing sites. Finally, just a couple of quick things. First of all, if you have any questions about Titan, you can feel free to shoot me an email. My email address is at the bottom. I promise I will answer it. The question is whether I will answer it 3 minutes after you send it to me or like a year from now, but I will answer, I promise. I'm not as active on Twitter as I used to be, but I'm there too. If you have questions or want to see about the stuff that we're doing here in my lab. I use that handle other social media places too if Twitter isn't your jam. And then the other thing I wanted to tell you, if you want to learn more about Titan or about any of the missions that I just talked about, there are 2 fantastic books. They were both written by Ralph Lorenz, who is one of the key scientists on Dragonfly. The first one is called Lifting Titan's Veil. It was written before Cassini, and it talks about kind of all of that early history that I started out telling you about, so the Voyager era and everything we knew about Titan that kind of led to the development of Cassini. And then Titan Unveiled was written a few years into the Cassini mission, and it talks about all of the amazing things that we learned from Cassini, but also gives you insight into how the spacecraft works and how all of those things got developed and how NASA missions really work. Both of these books are excellent. Ralph does not pay me to run around the world telling people to buy them, but they are really great books. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and answer any questions that folks have.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Excellent talk. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
If you'd just like to de-share your screen and we can get people up, and then we'll get people online to show a digital hand. If anybody in the club room's got a question, if they'd like to stand near the camera so I can see them from there. I've personally got a question, so I'll kick off.
Go for it.
My honour. Dragonfly, what's the power source? Is it plutonium or something?
Yeah, so Dragonfly will have a radioisotope thermal nuclear generator, RTG, just like Cassini had, just like New Horizons, just like Perseverance, Mars Curiosity. It's there really just isn't enough sunlight that gets down to the surface. So 10% of the sunlight that reaches Earth gets to Saturn, so it gets to the Saturn system and gets to the top of Titan's atmosphere, but then only 10% of that actually makes it down to the surface. So the brightest it ever is on Titan is kind of equivalent to twilight here on Earth. And so it would be very hard to do a mission with solar panels. So the RTG trickle charges a battery, and actually most of Dragonfly is a battery. So we kind of joke that we're mostly just a flying battery with a couple of scientific instruments attached to it.
Okay, I'm still not seeing anybody else. I'll have a follow-up question if you don't mind. You talked about the subsurface ocean, and I wondered whether any tidal effects from Saturn And I believe it's in Titan's in resonance with, is it Hyperion? Whether that would have any effect on sort of crustal deformation, tidal effects?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we're really hoping to understand better with the seismometer is what kind of crustal effects there are. We don't have, very high resolution imaging. And so for a lot of icy satellites, you can really see like tectonic processes that have occurred on the surface just by looking at, various irregular features and stuff like that. And we just really do not have that good of data for a Titan. So we're really excited about that. People have done a bunch of work also looking at the impact of tides on the lakes and seas. And if, there's a lot of tidal motion that's happening there. One of our outstanding questions is Titan really should have a circular orbit at this point. And it doesn't. Titan's orbit is still a little bit eccentric. And so we don't really understand why that is. And so there's definitely a lot of work to be done there to understand exactly what the subsurface ocean is doing and what its role is. We don't have a great estimate of how thick the crust is either. So we don't really know how deep the ocean is, which is another big outstanding question.
Mm-hmm. Right, we've got a question from Gregory McNiff.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Professor. That was a wonderful talk to the extent I understood it. I have two questions. One basic. I assume Dragonfly would bring back material for us to analyze or for you and your team to analyze. Just wanted to understand that. And then second, I understand you presented all the elements and the chemistry potentially that could suggest life, but is the next question to determine the level of glycine in like the oceanic surface and how the materials are mixing between the surface and the underground ocean? Seems like there's a second step that the chemicals are there, but they need to interact in some form.
Yeah, those are both really good questions. So unfortunately, Dragonfly is on a one-way trip, which is why we're flying a really capable mass spectrometer. So the mass spectrometer that we're flying is basically the most capable mass spectrometer that NASA will have ever flown. And so we have to really be able to do our analysis there. And so because of that, there's, already a lot of preparation underway here on Earth to make sure that we understand the way that instrument functions really well. I wish we could bring samples back. That's definitely on my bucket list, but I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime, unfortunately. To your other question, yeah, so that's one of the things we really want to understand is like how all of the different material that's made in the atmosphere actually interacts with the surface, how it interacts with the subsurface, what kind of timescales we're looking at, and all of those different things. There's definitely a huge step from there's a glycine molecule in the atmosphere to there's life on the surface. And we don't know what those steps are because we haven't figured them out for Earth yet. One of the things that we're kind of hoping is that in these impact craters that freeze after about 10 or 20,000 years, once they're frozen, the chemistry really should stop. And so we're kind of hoping that these impact crater lakes might be like little time capsules that kind of stopped in the spot that we don't have evidence of on Earth anymore, and can kind of show us like, okay, we took all the building blocks, we gave them water, and then after they did a bunch of stuff for a while, they froze. And like, what does that look like? Are we going to have like little like protocells in there? Are we going to have like really complex molecules? Are we going to have evidence of some kind of information containing molecule? Like, what did that chemistry look like after we ran an experiment on it for like 20 or 30,000 years? So I always joke that Titan is a natural scale laboratory that's been running an experiment for 4.5 billion years, and we just need to go get the results now.
Nice. That's very helpful. Thank you very much. It was a great talk.
You're welcome.
Peter Lloyd, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. That was a super talk. I've taken more notes, I think, than any other talk I've heard lately.
Thank you.
I actually have two questions. One of what was going to be the second one actually arises out of what you've just been saying, because I was wondering whether you're saying that the water methane lake that forms when a meteor hits, you get an impact rate. Are you suggesting that survives for a significant length of time in the liquid state?
Yeah, so it depends on, Oh, it depends. I feel like scientists are always like, oh, it depends. Sorry. It's hazard of the job.
I mean, I don't know what the melting point would be about.
Yeah. So it basically depends on two main things. It depends on how big the impactor is, so how much energy comes in the first place. And it depends what the surface is made out of, because the subsurface ocean has to have some kind of antifreeze. It's too cold for liquid water for there to be a liquid water ocean. And so we think there's probably a lot of ammonia, both in the subsurface and on the surface. So if there's a bunch of ammonia, then the impact will cause a lake that lasts even longer. But for a kind of normal size impactor that would leave a crater on Titan, like the type that we're looking for, and with kind of reasonable assumptions about how much ammonia there might be, we get estimates of those lakes lasting for like 20 or 30,000 years. That's very short geologic timescale, but that's a really long chemical timescale. And so like we're excited about that length of time because from laboratory experiments that we've done, we really think that like chemistry should have done what it was going to do unless it got excited about things and started catalyzing new reactions and making creatures and doing all kinds of other things.
So, so you said the temperature was what, 70 degrees K?
It's 94 at the surface.
94.
Yeah.
Oh, that's relatively warm, isn't it? I mean, I don't know what.
I'm not going there without a jacket, but you can do whatever you want.
I will have to look up what the freezing point of ammonia water mixes are. The other question was relative to the one. You said that Titan is differentiated, and I wonder whether that's unusual. Are the Galilean satellites differentiated? Do you know?
Oh man, I don't know. Like really testing my knowledge of the solar system today. I mean, I assume that Ganymede is differentiated for a couple of reasons, because it's the size of Titan and also because Ganymede has a magnetic field. So presumably Ganymede is fully differentiated. The weird thing about Titan is that we don't actually know how differentiated it is, which is really annoying. You know, you get these measurements by flying the spacecraft really close to the moon and looking at how the moon's gravity moves the spacecraft. And the closest we ever got Cassini to Titan was like 850 kilometers, which is not close enough to do good gravity measurements. So we know that Titan is at least is at least partially differentiated, but any answer from partially to fully differentiated fits our data. And so it's possible the interior is like a mixture of water, ice, and rock. It's also possible that there is like all of the rock concentrated at the core, but we don't actually have good constraints on that, which is really annoying.
Yeah, I just wonder whether Titan is in some ways special, because our moon is not differentiated, or not significantly, I believe.
Our moon is special, though.
Oh, is it?
They're all special in their own way. I will say that we do not think that Titan has an intrinsic magnetic field. So that is one of many ways at this point in which Titan and Ganymede are very different in a way that you might not expect based on the fact that they're the same size.
Yeah, Ganymede has a magnetic field, doesn't it? Yeah, yeah. So you've not got a moving, conducting fluid under there. No.
Apparently not.
Well, thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
We've got a question from the observatory.
Hi, Sarah. You mentioned about the methane content of the atmosphere probably only having between 10 and 100 million years left before it's fully depleted. Does that suggest, given the age of the moon, that at one point the atmosphere was predominantly methane, and he said now it's only about 2%, and most of the rest of it's nitrogen, that the majority of the atmospheric methane has already been altered by UV, and then for what's on the surface effectively at one point was fully atmospheric?
Yeah, so that's one option. We do think that Titan's atmosphere originally was ammonia and methane, and over 4.5 billion years, sunlight broke up the ammonia and reformed it to make nitrogen. So it would make sense that sunlight has been able to very strongly modify the composition of the atmosphere over time. So one option is that there was a lot more methane at the beginning. That's not a favored option for a lot of reasons that aren't particularly interesting to go into right now. Other options include Titan hasn't always had an atmosphere. There's some evidence from various surface measurements, looking at isotopes in the atmosphere, that something really catastrophic happened on Titan like 1 billion years ago. That could have been an extremely large impact. That could have been large cryovolcanic eruptions to do with a core dehydrating. In all of these scenarios of what catastrophic could have happened, could have thrown a bunch of methane into the atmosphere and resulted in the formation of an atmosphere where one didn't exist. And so then we don't have quite as bad of a timescale problem. Another option is that the methane is being resupplied. I think in general that tends to be the favored option. Which is annoying because we haven't been able to find a resupply mechanism. But that's one of the things that's really great about Dragonfly, because we do have a dedicated methane sensor. And so we'll really be able to get a sense of how variable the methane actually is on the surface. And if we were flying and started to notice a methane gradient, like an increase in methane as we were flying in a certain direction, I can assure you we would chase down the source of that gradient to see if maybe there were vents in the surface or small volcanic structures or something like that. We've only seen one structure on the surface from orbit that looks like it could potentially have been a volcano at some point, but we don't really have the resolution to see like a lot of vents, for example, or small volcanic structures. And so even though we haven't seen an erupting volcano, that doesn't necessarily mean that that isn't what is happening. We also think that there's a lot of methane trapped in the crust. So probably everybody's heard of methane clathrates. We hear about them for bad reasons on Earth because they're trapped in the deep sea and then it warms up and climate change makes the clathrates let methane out and then there's more climate change and it's bad. But we think the surface is probably methane clathrate. And so there's probably a lot of methane just trapped in the ice on the surface also. So it may be a really boring answer. It may just be that like it gets resupplied from the ice on the surface. I really hope we're going to answer this question with Dragonfly. This was like, if you go back and look at the science goals from Cassini, this was like one of the science goals from Cassini for Titan. And we, we were able to eliminate a lot of things. And I think we made progress towards answering the question, but it's really frustrating that we don't know the answer yet. One other completely wild possibility, which somebody has done some modeling about and has not written the paper, and it's been like 10 years now, and it's so frustrating to me. But one other completely wild possibility is that Titan is not 4.5 billion years old, and that Titan is maybe like only a few 100 million years old, which would be completely bananas, but apparently would also explain a lot of weird things about the Saturn system. So, kind of stay tuned to see if maybe that's the answer to our problem.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. We don't seem to have any more questions. Nobody's got a hand up. So, we have a quick hand up from Gregory.
No, I'm just curious on that thesis that Titan would only be a few 100 million years old. Wouldn't it like redshift or some kind of Doppler effect determine that? Or that seems like a very
yeah, it would be really hard to figure out if it's true. So I can explain this in like 2 minutes. I promise I'll be quick. So the idea is that Titan and Saturn are kind of weird in the solar system because of like if you take the ratio of the largest moons to the mass of their host planet, you kind of get like the same number for everybody, and then Titan's weird. And so it would make more sense if Saturn had more larger moons. And so somebody did some modeling that basically showed like if you started with 4 slightly smaller Titans, you could have them eventually form one normal sized Titan. And it would explain a bunch of things. There's a bunch of dynamical things about the Saturn system that are weird. So like I mentioned, Titan should have already circularized its orbit. So it's weird that it's eccentric. Some of the smaller and mid-sized moons also have very weird dynamical properties that don't make any sense. We have the rings, which also kind of don't make sense. And then some of the small moons are also just weird. Like Hyperion is like clearly something weird happened to form Hyperion. And so this person, Doug Hamilton, is the astronomer who has this idea, thinks that you could potentially explain all these weird things about the Saturn system by having started with like 4 large moons and having them all smushed together. And when he presented this to a room of like 100 Titan scientists and kind of like ducked after he said it, people got up and asked a bunch of questions, and he answered all the questions, and everybody was like, okay. Everybody seemed pretty okay with it. And so the deal is that his theory, though, doesn't constrain when it happened, because dynamically he only needs it to have happened at least like a few 100 million years ago, but then it could have been any time in solar system history, and that part doesn't matter. But then I mentioned we have this thing where like all of these things kind of point to something catastrophic happening about 1 billion years ago. So my if I was in charge of the world to make Titan the coolest thing ever, my version of history would be that about 1 billion years ago, 4 slightly smaller Titans smushed into each other to make one Titan, and that explains everything. But I'm not queen of the universe, unfortunately, so that's probably not what happened. But that's one version of what could have happened.
No, that's fascinating to the extent I even remotely understand it, but thank you.
That's okay, me neither.
Well, I'm looking around and I can't see any more waving hands. So, Sarah,
Quick
you.
one, if we've got them. I'll ask one quick one then if we've got a chance. One quick final question.
One quick question from the
op. You mentioned the Huygens probe and the Cassini-Huygens. You said it only lasted for about 2 hours on the surface. Was that by design or just a failure of the system? Or
yeah. So the Huygens probe descended about 2.5 hours on parachute, taking all of its measurements through the atmosphere. It was a probe, not a lander. At the time, and this is completely wild to me, we didn't know what the surface of Titan was made out of. And so they didn't want to build a spacecraft that had a requirement to survive landing, because it would have to be able to survive a bunch of different things. So they just said, screw it, it's a probe. There were no science requirements for the surface. It was not required to survive landing. The Huygens probe was on battery, and so it was always, a kind of ticking clock in terms of how long it could survive. We actually don't know how long it lived on the surface. The 90 minutes that I mentioned that it survived on the surface was the extent of time that it was in communication with Cassini. So at the end of that 90 minutes, Cassini set. And so Huygens had nobody to talk to. We're sure it sat there for at least a few more minutes trying to tell somebody something, but nobody was listening. And by the time, which was, I think, many weeks later, that Cassini would have been able to have contact with it again, it was long dead and frozen and out of power. So it did exactly everything it was supposed to do. Surviving landing gave us a bunch of additional data. We also know that the surface is very calm because, like I mentioned, it took like hundreds of those pictures. People have gone and like aligned them and nothing moved. And so there weren't like winds blowing that like had any kind of impact on the spacecraft while it sat there. And so even by sending us back the same picture over and over and over again, it actually did science for us, which is cool.
Okay. We'll take one last question. Peter Lloyd.
Oh, well, thank you, Royce. Yeah, sorry to come back to you, Sarah. You mentioned, I think, just now about craters on Titan. Are there very few craters on Titan?
Yeah. So I think we have like a little more than a dozen that have been definitively identified and named. We have something like 50 what we call suspiciously circular features. So we don't have a lot of topography data from the surface, and so you can't prove that something's a crater without topography data. And so we have about 50 things that, they're probably craters, but we don't know for sure. That is very few craters. So Titan's surface, has for a major body has one of the youngest surfaces in the solar system besides Earth. And that's a combination of a couple of things, because we don't, there's not like active plate tectonics or something, which is why Earth doesn't have very many craters. But we have erosional processes from wind and from rain, and fluid moving on the surface, but also the material that comes out of the atmosphere will infill craters over time. And so we don't expect there to be a lot of craters on the surface, and there aren't. And then also the atmosphere shields out most small impactors, so you have to be relatively substantial to actually make it to the surface in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, that's more or less what I thought you were going to say, because if there aren't many, then the surface has to be dynamic in some way. And it is in much the same way as the Earth is. They're worn away by wind and rain and ice and snow, if I can use
Exactly.
Infilled with all the muck that's coming down. So yes, thank you very much.
Yep, of course.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah, thank you very much for a really entertaining evening. I've fully enjoyed your talk. I'm sure everybody else does. I'm glad we finally got you, because I think we were supposed to have you give the talk about a year ago, and
yeah, I got COVID, so
got COVID, so
like the day before or something, which I felt really bad about. I'm much better now.
Well, we may have you back for updates on Titan when things happen.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. You all asked amazing questions.
Okay. At this stage, we're going to move on to sort of club business and what have you. So you're welcome to stay, but I'm sure it's not going to be that interesting for you. It's sort of for members and things like that. But
yeah, I'm gonna head out. But I had a great time, and thank you so much, and have a good rest of your meeting. Take care.
Yeah.